okay? So we know for a fact that no regime in history has ever been changed by air power alone. Every single successful regime change required ground troops. And in fact, what we know from military history studies is that technology doesn't really matter, okay? So what's the difference? There's a video from just yesterday, and the United States and Israel fire 11 interceptors at this one missile. So you're spending $11 million to $33 million to try to stop a $100,000 missile, and you fail. But if the United States tries to intercept 1,000 missiles, that costs them $11 billion to $33 billion. And most of the interceptors will miss anyway. The second major difference is strategic depth miscalculation. So the United States looks at Iran and thinks, we have sanctions on them for 40 years, they're struggling economically, this will be easy. Iran has been preparing for war with the United States for 20 years, since George Bush called them part of the axis of evil. They knew this war was coming. And in their religion, in their eschatology, this is the war against the great Satan. This is the most important war in their worldview. And they even had a practice run. In June 2024, there was a 12-day conflict. The Iranians were able to examine and analyze the strike capacities of both the Israelis and the Americans. They watched how the United States responded. They watched what weapons were used. So when the United States strikes Iran, Iran isn't surprised. Iran expected this. Iran is not primarily targeting American military bases. I mean, they are, but that's not the main strategy. The main strategy is to target the critical infrastructure of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, because these countries are the linchpin of the American economy. The GCC countries sell oil, they get paid in dollars, then they recycle those petrodollars back into the American economy. They invest in the US stock market, they invest in US real estate, and right now, the entire American economy is being propped up by one thing, AI investments. And a lot of that money is coming from the Gulf states. UAE is building massive data centers. So if Iran can destroy the GCC countries, the petrodollar system collapses. Because the American economy is basically a financial Ponzi scheme propped up by cheap money flowing from the Gulf. So how does Iran destroy the GCC countries? Two ways, actually. First, cut off their water. 60% of the GCC's water supply comes from desalination plants. These are factories that turn seawater into drinking water. If you destroy the desalination plant in Riyadh, that's a city of 10 million people, they'd be out of water in 2 weeks. Now, there are some ideas that everyone believes, but that are actually wrong. The first one is precision strikes, okay? Everyone talks about precision strikes. We have precision bombs. We can surgically remove targets. We don't need ground troops because we have precision strikes. But this is the precision strike illusion, okay? Can you name a single regime in history that was changed by air power alone? What about Serbia? But did the regime change? No. Milosevic stayed in power for another year. He only fell because of internal political pressure. Every successful regime change required ground troops to occupy the capital and physically remove the leadership. But people don't want to believe this because ground invasions are unpopular. They're expensive. They result in American casualties. So we convince ourselves that precision strikes will work. That technology has changed the game, but it hasn't. The second concept is technological superiority. In fact, advanced technology becomes a liability because it's expensive and you can't afford to lose it. You become risk averse. You try to minimize casualties. Meanwhile, the asymmetric side has nothing to lose. They can take risks, they can sustain losses, and eventually they outlast you, okay? The third concept is shock and awe, okay? This is the idea that if you hit the enemy with overwhelming force right at the beginning, they'll be so shocked that they'll just give up. Regime collapses, war over. But this is actually shock and stall. It doesn't work, okay? Shock and awe only works if the enemy fights on your terms. If they line up their army and you destroy it, yes, they might surrender. But if they refuse to fight conventionally, shock and awe is just expensive fireworks. You blow up some buildings. But the regime doesn't collapse. The leadership goes underground. The population becomes more resolved, and you're stuck, okay? Iraq 2003 is the perfect example. The initial invasion was shock and awe. The United States destroyed the Iraqi army in 3 weeks. Saddam's statues were pulled down. Everyone declared victory. But then what? 20 years of fighting. And this is what's happening with Iran. The United States is trying shock and awe, massive airstrikes, hundreds of targets, overwhelming force. But Iran was expecting this. Iran prepared for this. Iran's critical military assets are distributed and hidden. And Iran's strategy isn't to fight conventionally. It's to absorb the shock and then strike back asymmetrically, targeting economic infrastructure, using proxies, bleeding the United States economically and politically. And the problem is the United States is trying to play the 20th century game while Iran is playing the 21st century game. And you cannot win a 21st century asymmetric war using 20th century conventional strategies. It's like the rich versus poor thing we talked about before. The rich are playing the multiplication game and the poor are playing the subtraction game. They're different games with different rules. And if you use the wrong rules, you lose, okay? Every declining empire makes this mistake. Why? Because recent success creates overconfidence. Let me give you an example. In early 2025, the United States successfully kidnapped President Maduro of Venezuela. Special forces operation. In and out, quick, clean, successful. And this gave Trump an adrenaline rush. He thought, wow, the American military is amazing. We can do anything, okay? And this overconfidence led him to think that Iran would be just as easy. We'll strike Iran. The regime will collapse. Mission accomplished. But this is the same psychological trap that has destroyed empires throughout history. Hitler conquered most of Europe in 2 years. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland in 1 month. This success made Hitler think he was invincible. So he invaded the Soviet Union, and that destroyed the German army. The Soviets bled Germany to death. This is really important. Even if the war is bad for America as a country, the war might be good for Trump personally. And leaders optimize for their personal interests, not national interests. Let me explain, okay? Trump is getting massive financial support from Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Saudis invested $2 billion in Jared Kushner's private equity fund. Jared Kushner is Trump's son-in-law. $2 billion. That's a bribe. In exchange for what? In exchange for Trump being aggressive against Iran. The Saudis want regime change in Iran. They see Iran as an existential threat, so they're bribing Trump to attack Iran, okay? And Miriam Adelson, a major Israeli-American billionaire, has been financing Trump's political career for years. She recently said she would put up $250 million if Trump runs for a third term. $250 million. That's another bribe. In exchange for what? In exchange for Trump supporting Israeli interests. And Israel wants regime change in Iran. So they're bribing Trump too, okay? So Trump personally benefits from this war, even if America doesn't. He gets billions in financial support. He gets political backing for a third term. And here's another benefit. If the war goes badly and Trump is forced to use ground troops, he'll probably need congressional approval. And if there's a major war, he can claim emergency war powers. Emergency war powers allow the president to delay elections, to expand executive authority, to suppress opposition, okay? So if Trump is worried about losing the midterm elections, a war helps him. People rally around the flag during war. Opposition becomes unpatriotic. He can delay elections if there's a national emergency. He can consolidate power. So even if the war is a disaster for America, it might help Trump personally stay in power. Does that make sense? And this is a pattern we see throughout history. Leaders start wars not because the wars are good for the country, but because the wars are good for the leader personally. They consolidate power. They distract from domestic problems. They create enemies to rally against. So you can't understand why wars happen by asking, is this good for the country? You have to ask, is this good for the leader? And often the answer is yes for the leader, even when it's no for the country, okay? The third factor is the eschatological agenda, okay? This means religious end times beliefs. And this is gonna sound crazy, but hear me out. There's evidence that the world is run by secret societies, groups of very powerful people who have specific religious or ideological beliefs about how history should unfold, okay? If you look at the Epstein files, it's clear that there are networks of extremely powerful people who are connected through things that aren't public. We don't know exactly who they are or how they're organized, but they exist. And these people control governments, they control militaries, they control intelligence agencies, okay? And there are different names for these groups. Some people call them the Illuminati. Now, I'm not saying there's a single conspiracy. I'm saying there are multiple groups with overlapping interests. And three of the major groups are the Jesuits, who have significant influence in the Vatican and Catholic institutions, the Sabbatean Frankists, who have influence in modern Israel and believe in messianic prophecies, and the Freemasons, who have historical influence in American national security apparatus, okay? And these groups have eschatological beliefs. They believe that certain events need to happen for their religious prophecies to come true. And one of these events is a major war in the Middle East centered on Israel. Some believe this war is necessary to bring about the Messiah or to create heaven on earth or to fulfill biblical prophecy. The details vary, but the core idea is the same. This war is part of a script, a religious script, okay? And if you believe this, then rational cost-benefit analysis doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the war is unwinnable. It doesn't matter if it destroys the American economy. It doesn't matter if millions die, because you're following a religious script that you believe is divinely ordained. You're not trying to win a conventional war. You're trying to fulfill prophecy. Does that make sense? Now, I can't prove this is happening, but it would explain why American leaders are making decisions that seem completely irrational from a strategic perspective. Why they're ignoring military advisors who say this is a bad idea. Why they're proceeding despite obvious evidence that the strategy won't work. Now, the question becomes, is there any way regime change could still happen? Are there any escape routes? Any scenarios where the United States successfully changes the Iranian regime? And the answer is yes, but all of them are catastrophic. Let me explain, okay? The first possibility is ground invasion, okay? Ground invasion. As I said before, no regime has ever been changed by air power alone. You need boots on the ground. You need to physically occupy the capital, remove the leadership, install a new government. This is how it's always worked throughout history. Germany, Japan, Iraq, all required ground occupation, okay? So if the United States is truly committed to regime change, they will eventually have to send ground troops. And the pressure for this is building. Why? Because the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they're being pounded by Iranian strikes right now. Their oil facilities are being hit. Their water plants are threatened. They're facing economic collapse, okay? And these countries are going to demand that the United States protect them. They're going to say either pay Iran to stop, and we're talking about $5 trillion in indemnity, which the United States can't afford, or send ground troops to eliminate the Iranian threat once and for all. Binary choice, money or troops. And the United States can't pay, so it will have to be troops. Okay? Now, I know there's no political will among the American people for ground troops. 78% of Americans were against the initial strikes against Iran. The number against ground invasion would be even higher, probably 90%. But political will doesn't matter. Remember, 78% opposed the strikes, and they happened anyway. Leaders don't follow public opinion when it conflicts with their interests, okay? So ground troops are inevitable if the United States stays committed to regime change. But here's the problem. A ground invasion of Iran would be catastrophic. Iran is not Iraq. Iraq is flat desert, easy to invade. Iran is mountains, 85 million people compared to Iraq's 25 million in 2003, and the terrain is defensible. Urban warfare in Tehran would be worse than anything we saw in Iraq. Tehran is a city of 9 million people. The casualties would be immense, American and Iranian, okay? Plus, if the United States invades Iran, Russia and China will arm the Iranian resistance, just like the United States armed the Afghan resistance against the Soviets in the 1980s. They'll provide weapons, intelligence, training. The war would drag on for decades, cost tens of trillions of dollars, result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and probably still fail. So ground invasion is theoretically possible, but practically catastrophic. Does that make sense? The second possibility is economic collapse of Iran first, okay? Economic collapse. The idea is that sanctions and isolation will collapse the Iranian economy before the United States runs out of munitions. The Iranian people will rise up, overthrow the regime, install a pro-American government, war over, okay? But this is unlikely. Why? Because Iran has been under sanctions for 40 years. They've adapted, they've built a resistance economy, they have support from Russia and China, who are providing them with resources and technology. And the Iranian population, even those who don't like the regime, tend to unify against external threats, nationalism. So bombing Iran makes the regime more popular, not less, okay?